All right, so the next major era that we're going to be considering is the era of Romanticism. As you can see by the dates here, roughly kind of the first half, 2/3 of the 19th century. And this is an era which kind of represents another one of those swings that we've seen kind of throughout the history we've been looking at. That swings from the rational to the irrational and back again, as reflected in art and music and politics and thought. And so, if you remember, from last week when we were looking at things like the French Revolution and this era of rationality, this era of enlightenment, it was marked by reason and science and this very optimistic belief that kind of through philosophical reason, through logic, through mathematics, through science, that humanity could perfect itself or find an ideal way of organizing itself. And so it's out of those ideals we get this move away from monarchy and towards democracy that we see in the American and the French revolutions. Well, really, on the heels of all of that, on the heels of those revolutions, especially the French Revolution, this very bloody revolution, we get to swing away from the rational towards the irrational, and we have this era that's marked by many things that you might call the opposite of the hallmarks of that age of enlightenment. So a few things here. And we'll particularly kind of see this as it's located in the arts, in kind of the physical arts and the static arts, in painting and in music. But a move away from the rational towards the imagination, kind of the mystical, the free flowing as the supreme faculty of mind, the creative power of human beings, particularly to create art, literature, and music. A focus away from the city and back towards nature, and this is also kind of a move away from kind of the hardcore doctrinal aspects of the church, and the kind of romantic ideal is where you don't find God in the cathedral, you find God in the forest, and so nature as the most tangible realm of the divine. So this idea that civilization that was idealized during the Age of Enlightenment is now seen as kind of a false, hollow construct. We need to kind of go back to the beginning. This idea that we're looking for kind of that lost golden age. Can humanity not build the perfect city, but can it return to a Garden of Eden? This is also an era in which kind of literature and art and music are imbued with symbolism and myth. And so rather than looking at kind of mathematics and logical proofs as the most direct avenue towards the truth, symbolism and mythology were seen to be kind of a deeper, if again more mysterious way to get at the truth, particularly because symbolism and myth can suggest and speak several things at once, where a mathematical proof can only kind of point you in one direction at one particular time. And then kind of towards an idealization, well, maybe not an idealization, but a respect of emotion, intuition, instinct as being more important than reason. Yes, art is valuable because it can reveal the world within itself, and so a move away from the heart. You also see kind of this move during the Romantic era towards a kind of individualism. Now, individualism, of course, had been a hallmark of the Renaissance. This whole kind of notion of humanism was there at the beginning, but here, kind of a notion of the individual over the universal, the individual over the collective, and kind of the idealization of kind of the removed, mysterious, romantic, tortured hero. This is kind of the first era that we kind of see the notion, the kind of the connection between the tortured artist as being, or the kind of the tortured nature of the artist being as part of his or her genius, and that the artist, the great artist, is someone who is sets himself apart from society, and this is not seen as weird, but is seen as almost enviable. So if you look at this quote from Rousseau, kind of famous Enlightenment romantic thinker, "I am not made like anyone I have seen. I dare believe that I am not made like anyone in existence. If I am not superior, at least I am different." So again, I move away from the collective and focusing on the the distinctness of each individual. So yes, this is the era of the kind of the birth of the great artist hero, the musician as the tortured genius, the individual hero as the main character in literature. Yes, you might even see this as a return to, or in the West, the first time a real focus on the anti-hero, the hero in literature, the artist who pushes the boundaries, goes beyond what society permits, someone who just kind of achieves for the sake of achieving. And yeah, again, compare this to the previous century's focus on kind of emotional restraint and reason. It's in many ways the polar opposite. So artists also, you see it in the subject matter. It kind of turns away from the city and towards the nature. It turns away from kind of the wealthy and the royal towards the simple, we might say. And so lots of painters are interested in kind of simple country folk, domestic scenes. This is an era where people start to be interested in kind of local folklore, the tales of the village, children, and peoples like Native American peoples are kind of idealized in this idea that that children, in kind of the magical way that they see the world, Native Americans, the way that they live within the world, present themselves as a kind of noble savage and inherently more divine than the people of the city because they are so much closer to nature. You also see, this is also the we won't talk about it here, but this is also the era of the birth of kind of a Gothic fiction. This is the era of Edgar Allan Poe, kind of the birth of the grotesque, kind of proto-horror story. And so you get lots of stories that are interested in the supernatural and the spiritual, and the grotesque, like Victor Hugo's Hunchbacks of Notre Dame. Quasimodo, who is ugly on the outside but inside possesses an elevated soul. And so you find the mystical perhaps where you would least expect it, in the simple and in the monstrous. You also see kind of this in some cases even not just an idealization of nature, but a distrust of the city, of civilization. And you have some of these romantic poets and writers going out into nature to live their lives, a kind of a physical, tangible rejection of the city in pursuit of some kind of mystical transcendence. So probably most famously in the American tradition, you have guys like Henry David Thoreau, who removed himself completely from society and lived in his simple cabin on Walden Pond, and his reflections, his isolation there, out in nature. His reflections are still widely read today, and so he's sometimes seen as kind of a founding figure in what we call the transcendentalist movement, a kind of this idea that you're not going to find God in the church, you're going to find God in the forest, and you're going to experience the divine in a kind of mystical, almost Eastern kind of way, out in the forest and on the lake, and not in the city streets. So the Romantic era gives birth to lots of kind of static art that reflects kind of this idealization of nature. J.M.W. Turner, who is one of the early kind of Romantic painters, lots of his art kind of reflects this notion that nature will ultimately win. So here you see, this is a painting called Tintern Abbey, and it shows kind of the ruins of an old, what looks to be like a Gothic cathedral, medieval church. And here it's fallen apart, and it's gradually being overtaken by the vines and the trees. And kind of the inherent message is that the physical church that human beings build will only last so long, but the real church, quote unquote, nature, will always have its way and will return civilization to its original kind of Edenic like state. Here's another one from the same artist here. Here, Fishermen at Sea. I guess often these paintings will kind of show, if they show human beings at all, they're very small and they're very vulnerable. And while this is not a boat on a stormy sea, there is kind of, the sea is vast and it's multicolored, and this painting kind of invites you to wonder what lies just beneath kind of the dark and dangerous deep here. And it's very much the idea that human beings are at the whims of the changes of nature. So often seascapes, stormy seascapes, wide, vast seascapes, and very small individual human beings on it, again, tell that story. Human civilization is fragile. Nature is forever. Here's just a picture. I thought that, this is of course not a romantic painting, but I think it illustrates kind of this romantic idea very well. I found this, a friend of mine sent me this picture with the title of Thalassophobia, which is Greek for fear of the sea. And you see this tiny little boat, and then just beneath the waves you can see the outline of this giant whale there. And that's kind of that terrifying power of nature that lurks just beneath the surface of the waves is very much kind of a romantic idea. You also see in the paintings kind of, again, kind of that conquering hero. The individual, the rare individual who kind of is a master of nature at the same time. So here's C.D. Friedrich's A Wander Above the Sea of Fog. Here you still see kind of nature as mysterious and murky and mystical. You see kind of these peaks of these mountains here, kind of shrouded in the fog here. But what of course is foregrounded is our mountain climber, who stands there. His pose reminds me almost like Donatello's David, hand on the hip, hand in the pocket, one leg up. It's a very confident, conquering pose. He doesn't look winded at all, but he's climbed to the top of this mountain and he kind of surveys the landscape over which he is master. So you see kind of both that element of human beings at the mercy of nature, but also the great rare hero who can stand above nature is also a romantic ideal. Another one from Friedrich you see very much like Turner's Tintern Abbey. Same kind of thing. Here's an old church that is slowly, spookily being reclaimed by nature. There you can see very much kind of a gothic element to it. Gothic in terms of kind of the nightmarish, kind of the Edgar Allan Poe dark horror story nature. It looks like a very kind of eerie setting, but again, displaying kind of the victory of nature over civilization. Now here's a really interesting and telling kind of series of paintings. It's a series of 5 paintings, and I'll walk you through them briefly, which I think illustrates kind of this romantic ideal and kind of the temporary nature of civilization, and invites kind of the viewer to reflect on all of these paintings and maybe think about where you as the viewer stand in your own society. So this series of paintings is called The Course of Empire. And the first painting is called The Savage State, which you can see is it's kind of, and all of these paintings purport to kind of show generally the same area, but in these various stages of population and depopulation. So here we have the savage state, which again, kind of the weather looks a little bit stormy, the sea looks rough, it looks a little bit dangerous. This is kind of pure nature, but still very wild and unpredictable. We have kind of a hunter here kind of running through the forest chasing his prey. You see the deer down here. Civilization such as is very primitive. You see some like tent-like, teepee-like structures over here, and that's as far as civilization gets. So it's nature, but it's still very raw and dangerous. You're kind of living from hunt to hunt, as it were. Between the Arcadian state and the so-called consummation of empire, you can find there's room for kind of a balance between the manifestations of human civilization and kind of the wilds of nature. In the fourth painting, things fall apart. Destruction. Here is that same city has collapsed upon itself. There's war, there's destruction, there's fire, there's violence, there's people falling, being killed. It's absolutely absolute horror show. And here the god in charge here is no longer Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, but this is kind of a headless, blind Mars or Ares, the god of wild, violent war. And you can see this woman here is kneeling down and she's praying to the god who has no head, cannot see or hear. All is lost here. And so kind of this idea that eventually civilization, if not kept in check, will ultimately collapse upon itself. And then the fifth painting, Desolation. And this reminds me very much of that, like Turner's Tintern Abbey or the Abbey in the Oak Forest. The ultimate romantic message is that nature will have her way. And no matter what you build, how magnificent and how strong and how long-lasting it's meant to be, eventually it will return to a forest. It will return to a garden. And so you get this this Latin motto, "Sic transit gloria mundi," like thus passes the glory of the world. This idea that kind of all things that we build and do are transient and they will pass. And that's worth reflecting upon when you're thinking about what makes a life meaningful and what makes a healthy civilization. I think these are all key things that every generation, every person, every thinking, thoughtful person needs to grapple with. Now, in music, just one kind of example here. Beethoven, Ludwig van Beethoven, is probably the best example of a producer of romantic music. His Fifth Symphony, which I've put a link on the Blackboard site for you to give a listen to it. It's powerful music. It's probably arguably his most famous one. It's the one that begins dun 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 dun. It begins very dark in a very stormy minor key, and it's unlike kind of the sprightly allegros of Mozart or the wild complexity of Bach or Handel. Beethoven's symphonies, his music, are just drenched in anxiety and lightning flashes and thunder and that dark heroism, but it's also kind of frightening at the same time. And so it's the beginning of the symphony is just designed to kind of punch you in the face, reach out to you, grab you by the ears, and take you on this wild, anxious, emotional ride. There's a famous legend here that this symphony kind of reflects and correlates to kind of Beethoven's own kind of dark and stormy personality and trials that he was going through. He famously went deaf and continued to compose as it became more and more difficult for him to even hear what he was composing. So the symphony kind of reflect this composer, embattled, tortured, possessed, alone. It very much kind of fits that legendary notion and tradition that we have about the man Beethoven himself. All right, to close it out, this is also the era of kind of the great Romantic poets, particularly in the English tradition. This is John Keats. He was very good friends with Percy Shelley, also Lord Byron, all from the same era. And these are the guys who really, in many ways, kind of give the Romantic era its name. Romantic, it takes its name from Romantic Rome. And these poets, like Byron, like Keats, and like Shelley, are traveling to Greece and to Italy, and they're seeing the crumbling ruins of the Parthenon and the Colosseum, and they're finding kind of a haunting, again, tragic beauty in them. That this idea that these great civilizations, while the Colosseum can represent the greatness of Rome, but it can also represent kind of the loss of Rome itself and kind of the haunting shell of what Rome was there. And so a lot of their poetry focuses on again that romantic idea of all things are transient. Keats himself was a fairly tragic figure. He became ill at a very young age in his early 20s, and he actually went to Rome in the hopes that the fairer Mediterranean climate would help him. This is actually his house here, where he spent his final days and where he ultimately died. It's right outside the famous Spanish Steps here, arguably one of the most romantic spots in Rome today. Romantic in kind of the modern use of that word, having to do with romantic love, as it were. So Keats had an apartment here overlooking the Spanish Steps here, but the climate didn't help him. He ended up dying. And here's his grave. He was buried in Rome in a small Protestant cemetery, not all that far from where he died. And he knew he was going to die, and he had his wits enough about him to write his own epitaph here. And what he wanted for his grave, you can see this Greek style lyre here, the plucked stringed instrument, which immediately kind of connects him to kind of the ancient Greeks. But he didn't want his name on this. So again, almost this idea that he's got this tragic notion about himself. Why put my name on here when I will be forgotten? And so all it is the grave that contains all that remains of a young English poet, it says. And here's the famous line that he apparently composed himself. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. Right, and the idea is, as soon as you trace your name in water, all right, it disappears as you write it. Such is the transient nature of life. Such is the transient nature of the world. Such is kind of the dark, tragic, romantic view of art, of life, of meaning that broods over and haunts over this entire era. All right, thanks for listening. I will see you with the next one.